The summer of 1940 cast a shadow of fear across Britain. Every evening, as dusk enveloped the land, families would strain their ear for the ominous hum of aircraft engines, a sound that signified death could fall from above at any given moment. German bomber crews had devised a cunning tactic. By attacking under the cover of night, they rendered British fighters virtually helpless. The Spitfires and Hurricanes that had proven so effective during the day were powerless against the night. Pilots could no longer see their targets, and ground observers could not track the aircraft, which flew high above the darkness. The Luftwaffe believed they had discovered invisibility. Throughout July and August, Hermann Göring's bomber fleets would cross the channel under the veil of night, strike industrial centers and cities, then disappear into the black sky before anyone could respond. British anti-aircraft guns fired indiscriminately into the void, producing impressive displays of trace of fire and explosions that rarely found their mark. Night fighters roamed assigned sectors, hoping for sheer luck to lead them to an enemy plane. The chances of finding a single aircraft in a sea of dark sky were astronomical, like searching for a needle in a haystack while blindfolded. German losses during night raids were minimal, sometimes just one or two aircraft due to mechanical failures, rather than interception. However, what the Luftwaffe pilots didn't realize was that they were already being observed. Along the eastern and southern coast of Britain, a network of peculiar steel towers had been standing quietly since before the war. These towers, some towering over 350 feet high, looked like electricity pylons designed by someone with a flair for the abstract. Locals had grown used to them, though few understood their true purpose. The towers were part of a system called chain-home, which was about to revolutionize aerial warfare. The towers' true significance lay not in their height or unusual appearance, but in their capabilities. While German pilots believed they were invisible to the British, operators in small rooms beneath these towers were tracking every aircraft approaching the coast. They could see bombers gathering over France, watch them cross the channel, and track their movement deep into British airspace. The detection range was unprecedented for the time. Chain-home could detect aircraft formations up to 100 miles away, granting British commanders valuable minutes to scramble fighters and direct them toward the approaching threat. The technology itself was not even a closely guarded secret. German intelligence had photographed the towers, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had observed them numerous times. What the Germans failed to understand was how effectively the British had integrated this technology into a fully operational air defense system. They assumed the towers were either experimental or part of some communication network, never considering the possibility that radio waves could detect aircraft at such vast distances. Despite their own scientists exploring similar concepts, the idea seemed implausible to many German officers. By September 1940, as the Blitz escalated, German bomber crews continued to operate under the false assumption that night provided them with adequate protection. They were about to learn otherwise. The invisible shield guarding Britain wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was woven from radio waves, mathematics, and the resolve of men and women who had turned technological innovation into a practical reality. These towering coastal sentinels would soon prove that the darkness no longer ensured safety, and that the hunters could become the hunted, even in the dead of night. The story of Chain-home began not with a military emergency, but with an idea that seemed more like science fiction. In February 1935, Robert Watt, a Scottish physicist working at the Radio Research Station in Slough, received a peculiar query from the Air Ministry. Could radio waves be used as a death ray to destroy enemy aircraft? Watt's response was straightforward. No, radio waves couldn't destroy aircraft, but they could certainly detect them. He submitted a memorandum titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods on February 12, 1935. Within weeks, the Air Ministry authorized a demonstration. On February 26, 1935, a Hafer bomber flew back and forth along a set path near Daintree, Northamptonshire. Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins positioned a receiver to pick up BBC shortwave signals reflected off the bomber's metal body. The demonstration was a success. The bomber's position was clearly displayed on a cathode ray oscilloscope. With $10,000 from the Air Ministry, further development was swiftly underway. By June 1935, Watt's team had achieved detection ranges of 17 miles, proving the technology's viability. Britain's air defense strategy was about to undergo a groundbreaking shift. Development accelerated through 1936 and 1937, with the first experimental station established at Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast. A Victorian mansion would become the birthplace of operational radar, and engineers soon realized that taller structures were essential for improving the system's performance. The transmission towers were designed to produce better results, ultimately utilizing steel lattice masts that stood 360 feet tall. The receiving aerials were placed on separate wooden towers, each 240 feet high, to capture the returning echoes. The system functioned on frequencies between 20 and 30 megahertz, with wavelengths between 10 to 13 meters. Initially, it was known by the code name RDF, range and direction finding, but it would eventually be recognized as radar. By 1938, the Air Ministry had committed to building a network of stations along Britain's eastern and southern coasts. The plan was for 20 stations to be built initially, spaced about 25 miles apart to provide overlapping coverage. Construction teams worked tirelessly throughout 1938 and 1939 to erect the distinctive towers that would become iconic. Each chain home station required 4 transmitting towers positioned in a line along the coast, with 4 receiving towers placed around 200 feet in front of them. The spacing and alignment of the towers were crucial to the accuracy and range of the detection system. The engineering challenges were significant. These towers had to withstand the strong coastal winds while supporting heavy copper aerials strung between them. The transmitters emitted 350 kilowatts of power in short pulses, which required robust electrical systems and cooling mechanisms. Each station had to have its own power supply, backup generators, and communication links to integrate it into the broader air defense network. The operations rooms also required specialized plotting equipment, telephone exchanges, and enough space to accommodate the teams of operators who would work around the clock. What made chain home truly revolutionary wasn't just the technology, but the operational strategy behind it. Watson Watt and the planners of the Air Ministry recognized that detection alone wasn't enough. Information needed to reach the fighter commanders quickly to be effective. Chain home stations were connected by dedicated telephone lines to the fighter command's filter rooms and operation centers. This integration allowed radar data to be converted into fighter interceptions in minutes rather than hours. The system transformed air defense from a reactive scramble into a coordinated response. By the time war broke out on September 3, 1939, Chain Home had 19 operational stations providing coverage from Southampton to the Scottish border. The network remained fully operational during the Battle of Britain, with operators tracking every major Luftwaffe raid. Those awkward steel towers, dismissed by some German observers as experimental oddities, formed the world's first operational early warning radar system. They gave Britain what every defender dreams of: time to prepare and the ability to detect the enemy before they arrived. The fundamental principle behind Chain Home was straightforward, though its practical implementation required considerable ingenuity. The transmitting towers sent out powerful radio pulses into the sky, brief bursts of electromagnetic energy that lasted only 20 microseconds. These pulses traveled at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, until they hit something solid, like an aircraft. When radio waves hit metal, some of the energy bounced back toward the coast, where the receiving towers picked up the returning echo. By measuring the time it took for the waves to return, operators could calculate the distance of the aircraft. Radio waves travel roughly 1 mile every 5 microseconds, so if an echo returned after 500 microseconds, it indicated that the aircraft was approximately 50 miles away. Calculating the range was a simple matter of mathematics, but interpreting the returning signals required skill and experience. The echoes appeared as bright spots or blips on cathode ray tube displays, with a vertical position indicating range and the brightness suggesting the size of the target. Operators needed to distinguish real aircraft signals from false ones caused by atmospheric conditions, electrical interference, or ground reflections. Ships at sea or flocks of birds could sometimes produce strong echoes. Experienced operators learned to recognize the distinctive patterns of various targets. Bomber formations produced larger, more persistent returns in single aircraft, and atmospheric effects created recognizable patterns that could be mentally filtered out. Finding the altitude of the aircraft was more challenging. Chain Home couldn't measure altitude directly like it could range. Instead, it used a clever method to exploit radio wave behavior. The receiving aerials were arranged at different heights on the wooden towers, so aircraft flying at different altitudes would produce slightly different signal patterns on these aerials. By comparing the strength and phase of the signals received at different heights, operators could estimate the aircraft's altitude, whether it was flying at 5,000 feet, 15,000 feet, or somewhere in between. While this method wasn't perfectly accurate, estimates could be off by several thousand feet. It still provided enough information for fighter controllers to position interceptors at roughly the correct altitude. The bearing of the aircraft was determined using another principle. Each chain home station had multiple receiving towers arranged in a precise geometric pattern. Radio waves coming from different directions would reach these towers at slightly different times, creating measurable phase differences. By comparing signals from these various towers, operators could determine the compass bearing of the aircraft with reasonable accuracy, typically within a degree or two. Combining this with range data, stations could plot an aircraft position on a map grid. The movement of aircraft over time revealed its heading and speed, which was crucial for predicting where it would be in 10 to 15 minutes when fighters could potentially intercept. However, the system had several limitations that operators had to constantly work around. Chain home performed exceptionally well at detecting aircraft approaching from the sea, but once bombers crossed the coastline, ground return created so much clutter that it obscured the aircraft echoes. Essentially, the radar became blind to aircraft flying over land, forcing the observer corps to take over. Thousands of volunteers were stationed throughout Britain to watch and listen for aircraft, then report their findings to the filter rooms by telephone. Additionally, chain home had difficulty detecting low-flying aircraft. The radar beams projected upward at a shallow angle, creating a dead zone below about 2,000 feet where detection was unreliable. German pilots who discovered this weakness sometimes approached Britain at very low altitudes to evade radar coverage. The pulse repetition frequency also had limitations. Chain home transmitted 25 pulses per second, meaning the maximum unambiguous range was about 190 miles. Beyond this range, echoes from one pulse might return after the next pulse was already transmitted, causing range ambiguities. In practice, reliable detection ranged from 120 miles for high-altitude formations to perhaps 80 miles for smaller groups or individual aircraft. Weather conditions also affected performance, with heavy rain or unusual atmospheric layers occasionally degrading the signal quality or causing false returns. The raw data from chain home stations would have been ineffective without the human systems that process it into usable intelligence. Each radar station employed teams of operators working in shifts, their eyes fixed on glowing cathode ray tubes in darkened rooms. When a target appeared, the operator would read off the range, bearing, and estimated height, then immediately phone these coordinates to the filter room at Fighter Command's headquarters in Bentley Priory, north of London. This phone call would typically occur within 30 seconds of detection, setting in motion a carefully orchestrated response that had been honed through months of practice and real-world operations. The filter room was a nerve center of Britain's air defense system, although few people outside the military knew of its existence. Inside the secure facility, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WWII, sat at desks wearing headsets, receiving plots from multiple chain home stations at once. Their job was to filter the data, which is why the room was named the filter room. When several stations reported targets in roughly the same location, the filterers would compare timings, ranges, and bearings, then consolidate the information into a single track, passing it on to the plotters in the operations room next door. This filtering process eliminated duplicate reports and reduced the overwhelming influx of data into a coherent picture of what was actually happening in the sky. The operations room was a remarkable space, epitomizing British ingenuity under pressure. At its heart was a massive table map of Britain and the surrounding waters, marked with a grid system that divided the coverage area into precise squares. Surrounding this table were plotters, mostly young women in uniform, each holding a wooden rake-like tool. When filtered tracks arrived by telephone or intercom, the plotters would move colored counters across the map to represent enemy formations. Each counter had numbers indicating the aircraft's height, strength, and identification codes. The counters changed color every 5 minutes based on a clock system. Red meant fresh information, less than 5 minutes old. Yellow indicated 5 to 10 minutes, and blue represented 10 to 15 minutes. This color coding allowed controllers to instantly gauge how current the information was, which was critical when deciding whether to scramble fighters. Above the plotting table, a glassing gallery housed the controllers and senior officers who directed the defensive response. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded Group 11, responsible for defending London and the southeast, would stand in his operations room at Uxbridge, watching his sector develop on the table below. He could see every raid forming over France, every formation crossing the Channel, and the British fighter squadrons at his disposal. When the plots indicated a major raid, Park would order squadrons to readiness, then to cockpit readiness, and finally scramble them when the threat's direction became clear. The time from the first radar detection to fighters becoming airborne was typically about 6 minutes, although under exceptional circumstances, this could be reduced to 3 minutes or extended to 10 minutes. The communication systems that linked everything together were as vital as the radar itself. A dedicated network of telephone lines and teleprinters connected chain home stations to filter rooms to operations rooms, and operations rooms to sector A fields where fighter squadrons awaited orders. Radio telephone sets and fighters allowed ground controllers to vector pilots toward enemy formations using a grid reference system. Controllers would send instructions like Bandits, Angels 15, Vector 090, meaning enemy aircraft at 15,000 feet, steer a course of 90 degrees east. Pilots would acknowledge and turn accordingly, trusting the controllers they couldn't see to guide them toward targets they couldn't yet spot. The human element made everything work. Radar operators needed weeks of training to reliably interpret their displays. Filters developed an almost intuitive sense for which plots represented genuine threats and which were spurious. Plotters had to work with. The movement of aircraft over time revealed its heading and speed, crucial for predicting where it would be in 10 to 15 minutes when fighters might be able to intercept. However, the system had limitations that operators constantly had to adapt to. Chain Home excelled at detecting aircraft approaching from the sea, but once bombers crossed the coastline, the ground returns created overwhelming clutter that masked the aircraft echoes. Essentially, the radar became blind to aircraft flying over land, so the responsibility of tracking them was passed on to the Observer Corps. Thousands of volunteers stationed across Britain watched, listened, and reported aircraft sightings to filter rooms via telephone. Furthermore, Chain Home struggled with low-flying aircraft. The radar beam projected at a shallow upward angle, creating a dead zone below approximately 2,000 feet, where detection became unreliable. German pilots, who discovered this vulnerability, sometimes flew at extremely low altitudes to slip under the radar coverage. Another constraint was the pulse repetition frequency. Chain Home transmitted 25 pulses per second, meaning its maximum unambiguous range was about 190 miles. Beyond that distance, echoes from one pulse might return after the next pulse had already been transmitted, creating range ambiguities. In practice, reliable detection ranged from 120 miles for high-altitude formations to around 80 miles for smaller groups or individual aircraft. Weather conditions also impacted performance, as heavy rain or unusual atmospheric layers could degrade signal quality or cause false returns. The raw data from Chain Home stations would have been useless without the human systems that process it into actionable intelligence. Each radar station employed teams of operators who work around the clock, their eyes glued to glowing cathode ray tubes in darkened rooms. When a target appeared, the operator would report its range, bearing, and estimated height, and phone these coordinates to the filter room at Fighter Command's headquarters in Bentley Priory, just north of London. This call typically occurred within 30 seconds of detection, setting off a carefully orchestrated response that had been refined over months of practice and real operations. The filter room, the heart of Britain's air defense, operated in secrecy, with few outside the military knowing it even existed. Inside, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WWII, sat at desks wearing headsets, receiving radar plots from multiple Chain Home stations. Their job was to filter out redundant data, which is why the room earned its name. When multiple stations reported targets in the same area, the filters compared the timings, ranges, and bearings, and consolidated the information into a single track before passing it on to the plotters in the operations room. This process eliminated duplicate reports, allowing operators to form a clear picture of what was actually happening in the sky. The operations room was a testament to British ingenuity under pressure. At the center was a massive map of Britain and its surrounding waters, marked with a grid system that divided the coverage area into squares. Around this table were plotters, mostly young women in uniform, each holding a wooden rake-like tool. When filtered tracks arrived by phone or intercom, plotters moved colored counters across the map to represent enemy formations. Each counter carried numbers indicating the aircraft's height, strength, and identification codes. The counters changed color every 5 minutes based on the clock system. Red meant fresh information, yellow indicated 5 to 10 minutes, and blue represented 10 to 15 minutes. This color coding helped controllers quickly assess how up-to-date the information was, which was critical when deciding whether to scramble fighters. Above the table was a glassed-in gallery where controllers and senior officers could observe the developing situation. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded Group 11, responsible for defending London and the southeast, stood in his operations room at Uxbridge, watching the action unfold below. He could see every raid assembling over France, every formation crossing the channel, and every squadron available for interception. When plots showed a significant raid, Park would order squadrons to readiness, then to cockpit readiness, and finally scramble them when the threat's direction became clear. The time from initial radar detection to fighters being airborne was typically around 6 minutes, though in exceptional cases, this could be reduced to 3 minutes or extended to 10 minutes. The communication networks that linked all the components were as crucial as the radar itself. A dedicated network of telephone lines and teleprinters connected chain home stations to filter rooms to operations rooms, and operations rooms to sector airfields where fighter squadrons were stationed. Radio telephone sets and fighters allowed controllers to guide pilots toward enemy formations using a grid reference system. Controllers would give instructions like Bandits, Angels 15, Vector 090, meaning enemy aircraft at 15,000 feet should steer east at 90 degrees. Pilots would acknowledge and turn accordingly, trusting controllers they couldn't see to guide them toward targets they couldn't yet spot. The human element was integral to the system's success. Radar operators required weeks of training to interpret the radar displays accurately. Filters developed an almost intuitive sense of which plots represented real threats and which were spurious. Plotters worked quickly and precisely. German pilots, who would place their trust in protection offered by night, found themselves outmatched by the very technology they had dismissed as ineffective. The night of October 15, 1940, marked a crucial turning point in Britain's defense, though its full significance wouldn't be recognized for weeks. Luftwaffe bombers crossed the channel in multiple waves, targeting London, Birmingham, and Liverpool. Chain home stations tracked each formation from the moment they took off from French and Belgian airfields. The plots were passed to fighter command with incredible precision, a large formation building over Calais at 21:47, crossing the channel at 22:23, and making landfall near Dover at 22:17. Controllers scrambled 5 night fighter squadrons, directing them toward predicted interception points based on the bomber's speed and course. Flight Lieutenant Gregory and his crew, flying a Beaufighter from 604 Squadron, received vectors directing them northeast over Kent. The voice of their ground controller crackled through the radio. Bandit bearing 045, range 12 miles, Angels 15,000. Gregory turned onto the specified heading and climbed to 15,000 feet, while his radar operator, Pilot Officer Ronsley, focused on the primitive AI Mach V radar mounted in the nose of the Beaufighter. The ground controller provided updates every minute, gradually closing the gap between hunter and prey. At a separation of 4 miles, Ronsley picked up a faint green blip, indicating an aircraft ahead and slightly above. Gregory increased throttle, climbing gently as Ronsley called out corrections. Left, steady, target ahead. 1 mile, slightly high. At 800 yards, Gregory spotted the bomber silhouetted against scattered clouds, its exhaust flames visible as tiny pinpoints of light. The aircraft was a Heinkel He-111, droning steadily westward, unaware that it had been tracked for the past 20 minutes. Gregory closed to 200 yards, positioned himself directly astern and slightly below, and fired a 3-second burst from his 4 20mm cannons. The Heinkel's port engine erupted in flames, and pieces of cowling spun into the night. The bomber rolled left, attempting evasive maneuvers, but Gregory followed, firing again. This time, his shells struck the fuselage and starboard wing. The Heinkel dove steeply, trailing fire, and crashed near Maidstone at 22:41. The entire interception, from first radar contact to the kill, took just 14 minutes. Similar scenes unfolded across southern England that night. Another Bullfighter from 29 Squadron intercepted a Junkers Ju-88 over Sussex, guided to within visual range by chain-home plots. A Blenheim from 23 Squadron caught a Dornier Do-17 over Essex after a 20-minute pursuit, directed by ground controllers. Not every interception was successful. Many bombers escaped after brief radar contact, and some fighters never acquired their targets despite being vectored to the right area. However, the success rate was steadily increasing as crews gained experience and the coordination between ground controllers and airborne fighters improved. The night of November 14, 1940, brought devastation to Coventry when over 400 Luftwaffe bombers devastated the city in Operation Moonlight Sonata. Chain-home tracked the massive formation assembling over northern France throughout the afternoon and evening. Fighter Command scrambled every available night fighter squadron, but the scale of the raid overwhelmed Britain's defensive resources. Fighters downed just one confirmed bomber that night, though anti-aircraft fire and accidents claimed several more. The raid killed over 500 civilians and destroyed much of Coventry's medieval center. Yet, this raid also marked the peak of German night bombing effectiveness. The Luftwaffe had achieved a tactical success, but at a cost they did not yet fully comprehend. By reviewing loss reports from November and December, German intelligence officers noticed a troubling pattern. Aircraft were being intercepted far from their targets, often within minutes of crossing the British coast. Losses during night operations rose from approximately 2% in September to nearly 5% by December. While this might not seem significant, sustained losses at this rate would severely deplete the bomber force within months. Even more alarming were reports from surviving crews of encounters that seemed improbable. One pilot reported a British fighter attacking him over the channel, 40 miles from the nearest British airfield, in complete darkness with no searchlights nearby. Another crew described being intercepted twice during a single mission by different fighters, as though they were being tracked continuously and handed off between defenders. By January 1941, Luftwaffe operational planners were forced to confront the reality. British air defenses had a way of detecting and tracking bombers at long range, even at night. Whether this was achieved through radar, radio direction finding, or some other technology remained uncertain, but the operational consequences were clear. The belief that darkness provided effective protection could no longer be upheld. Night bombing would continue, as Germany had few alternatives for striking Britain, but crews would need to adopt new tactics. Flying at very low altitudes to evade radar became standard procedure for some missions. Radio silence became mandatory. Routes were varied constantly to avoid creating predictable patterns. However, none of these measures resolved the fundamental problem. Britain could see them coming, and that changed everything. The Luftwaffe assumption that they were safe in the dark had been shattered. The belated recognition of British radar superiority led to urgent efforts by Germany to neutralize this advantage. German scientists and signals intelligence officers began systematically studying British radar transmissions, closely monitoring the frequencies used by chain-home and analyzing their characteristics. By early 1941, the Luftwaffe had identified the primary operating bands between 20 and 30 MHz and understood the basic pulse patterns. This knowledge allowed them to develop jamming equipment designed to overwhelm British radar receivers with noise, rendering the radar plots unreadable. The first jamming transmitters went into operation in February 1941, positioned along the French coast to broadcast interference directly towards British radar stations. The initial jamming efforts produced mixed results. German transmitters flooded chain-home frequencies with continuous static or false signals, causing British operators to report degraded radar displays with genuine aircraft returns obscured by electronic noise. However, British engineers had anticipated this threat and incorporated countermeasures from the beginning. Chain-home could operate on multiple frequencies, so operators could simply retune their equipment to avoid the jam channels. Additionally, the British developed techniques for recognizing jamming patterns and mentally filtering them out, much like they had learned to ignore weather returns and ground clutter. What appeared to be overwhelming interference on a display could often be managed by experienced operators trained to handle such scenarios. As the technological competition escalated through 1941, Germany deployed more sophisticated jamming equipment and began experimenting with electronic deception transmitters designed to mimic genuine radar returns, creating false targets in an attempt to overwhelm British filter rooms with spurious plots. Some German bombers were equipped with primitive radar warning receivers, alerting crews when British radar was tracking them and allowing them to take evasive action. The Luftwaffe also discovered Chainholme's low-altitude blind spot through trial and error. Bombers flying below 2,000 feet often escaped detection entirely, though navigating at such low altitudes over water at night presented significant risks. In response, Britain developed a new generation of radar stations called Chainholme Low, which supplemented the original network by using higher frequencies and different aerial configurations optimized for detecting low-flying aircraft. Operating in the 200 MHz range with wavelengths around 1.5 meters, Chainholme Low filled the altitude gap exploited by German pilots. Although these stations couldn't match Chainholme's long-range detection, topping out at around 35 miles, they provided vital coverage of low-altitude approaches missed by conventional radar. Fighter Command also significantly upgraded its night fighter fleet. The Beaufighter, entering service in late 1940 and 1941, was equipped with progressively better airborne radar sets. The AI Mark IV was replaced by the AI Mark VII, offering enhanced range and discrimination. These airborne radars operated at much higher frequencies than Chainholme, around 200 MHz, which provided better resolution but at shorter ranges. The tactical concept remained unchanged. Ground controllers would use Chainholme to guide fighters to within a few miles of bomber formations, at which point airborne radar would guide the final approach to visual range. As both equipment and crew proficiency improved, the system became increasingly effective. Germany invested heavily in its own radar development, producing capable equipment for naval and air defense purposes. The Weisberg radar, entering service in 1940, provided excellent accuracy for directing searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. The Freya radar offered early warning coverage for German-occupied territories. Ironically, German radar technology was often more advanced than British equipment. The Weisberg used parabolic dishes and sophisticated tracking mechanisms that Chainholme's fixed arrays couldn't match. What Germany lacked wasn't technical capability, but strategic vision. The Luftwaffe never developed an integrated air defense system comparable to Britain's network. German radar stations operated largely independently, passing information through cumbersome command chains that delayed responses. The British advantage lay not in superior technology, but in superior integration. Chainholme Low, the observer corps, filter rooms, operations rooms, sector control, and fighter squadrons all worked together as a single coordinated system. Information flowed seamlessly from detection to decision to action. German efforts to jam or deceive British radar only addressed one part of a much larger whole. Even when jamming degraded radar performance, the observer corps could visually track aircraft once they crossed the coast. Radio intercepts of German navigation beacons revealed target cities before bombers arrived. Listening posts monitored Luftwaffe radio traffic, providing tactical intelligence. No single point of failure could collapse the entire defensive network. By late 1941, the German night bombing campaign against Britain had largely failed. The Blitz officially ended in May 1941 when Hitler redirected the Luftwaffe eastward for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. German bomber losses during night operations had climbed to unsustainable levels, sometimes exceeding 6 or 7% per raid, forcing operational changes that further weakened their effectiveness. The reduced effectiveness of German bombing campaigns had a significant impact. Britain's cities had endured immense suffering, with over 40,000 civilians killed and large areas devastated. Yet, the nation remained resilient, and its war production actually increased throughout 1941. Chainholme, and the defensive system it supported, had achieved its primary objective, making the cost of attacking Britain too high for Germany to maintain. The influence of Chainholme extended far beyond the tactical victories it enabled in 1940 and 1941. The system proved beyond doubt that radar could form the foundation of national air defense, a lesson that would change military thinking around the world. Before Chainholme, air defense relied mainly on observers with binoculars and telephones, giving defenders maybe 5 minutes warning before bombs began to fall. Chainholme expanded that window to 20 or 30 minutes, fundamentally altering the defensive equation. Fighter Command could now position forces proactively rather than reactively, conserving strength by engaging only those raids that posed real threats. This efficiency meant that fewer fighters could protect a larger area, a critical advantage when Britain faced pilot shortages during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain. The strategic consequences of this breakthrough spread through Allied planning. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, U.S. military observers who had studied Britain's air defense system returned home with detailed reports on radar's potential. This knowledge accelerated American radar development, leading to sets like the SCR-270, which detected the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, though the warning was tragically ignored. By 1943, American forces had deployed sophisticated radar networks across the Pacific and Europe. Building on principles proven by Chainholm, the cavity magnetron, a British invention shared with America in 1940, allowed for centimetric radar operating at wavelengths around 10 centimeters, far smaller than Chainholm's 10M. This technology revolutionized airborne radar, naval fire control, and ground mapping, all of which were based on foundations laid by those towering steel masts along Britain's coast. The Battle of Britain itself might have turned out differently without Chainholm. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who commanded Fighter Command, later stated unequivocally that radar was essential to their victory. In August and September 1940, when the Luftwaffe launched massive daylight raids aiming to destroy Fighter Command, the ability to track German formations from the moment they assembled over France allowed British fighters to meet them at advantageous positions and altitudes. German pilots often expressed confusion over how British fighters seemed to know exactly where and when to intercept. The answer lay in those coastal towers, detecting raids at ranges over 100 miles and feeding precise information to controllers who orchestrated the defensive response. Statistical analysis supports this view. During the critical phase of the Battle of Britain, Fighter Command flew approximately 50,000 sorties and achieved about 2,600 confirmed kills against German aircraft. Without radar, interception rates would have plummeted. Fighters would have wasted fuel and ammunition on fruitless patrols while actual raids slipped through undetected. The efficiency boost provided by radar allowed Britain's outnumbered fighter force to engage German raiders repeatedly, inflicting unsustainable losses on the Luftwaffe. By late September 1940, Göring had no choice but to abandon daylight bombing and switch to night operations, tacitly admitting that German bombers couldn't survive against Britain's radar-directed defense. The human cost of Chainholm's success must also be acknowledged. Thousands of men and women worked tirelessly in radar stations, operations rooms, and filter centers to make the system function. WAAF officers plotted raids for hours in underground facilities, working under constant pressure and breathing stale air. Radar operators spent grueling shifts staring at flickering green displays, knowing that a misdetection could result in bombs falling on undefended cities. Fighter pilots trusted their lives to controllers they never met, following vectors into the teeth of German formations. The Observer Corps volunteers stood watching exposed posts across Britain, tracking aircraft by sound and sight, regardless of the weather. This collective effort, blending technology with human dedication, created a defensive capability that ultimately saved Britain from invasion, and perhaps from defeat. Modern air defense systems owe much to the innovations of Chainholm. Every integrated air defense network today, from NATO's installations to those protecting major cities worldwide, follows a similar fundamental structure. Early warning radars detect threats at long range, data processing centers filter and track targets, command centers coordinate responses, and interceptors engage based on precise guidance. While technologies have advanced, phase array radars, satellite links, computer processing, and beyond visual range missiles, the operational concept remains closely aligned with what Watson Watt and Fighter Command pioneered 85 years ago. The Chainholm towers themselves continued to operate throughout the war, with some remaining active into the 1950s as British radar technology evolved through successive generations. Most were eventually demolished, though a few stand today as historical monuments. The station at Great Baddow in Essex still preserves one of the original wooden receiver towers, a silent tribute to the technology that helped save Britain. Though these structures may look primitive compared to modern radar installations, they represented a monumental leap forward. They marked a moment when defenders gained the ability to detect threats approaching from beyond the horizon. The lesson that Chainholm taught is still relevant today. Technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory, but technological advantage, integrated into a well-organized operational system, can be decisive. German bomber pilots had believed that darkness made them invisible, a reasonable assumption given the technology of the era. But they were wrong. Britain had invested not only in the technology to detect aircraft at unprecedented ranges, but also in systems that could translate detection into coordinated defensive action. Those towering steel masts detected German formations 100 miles away and stripped away the supposed invisibility of darkness. By doing so, they changed the course of the war and demonstrated that in modern conflict, information dominance can be just as crucial as raw firepower. Britain survived its darkest hour because engineers, scientists, and operators made the invisible visible and turned the night sky into a battlefield where the defenders held an unexpected advantage.